So I'm going to encourage people. This is actually a suggestion from one of our audience members, Paula, from the Petaluma Library. The Petaluma Museum, I'm sorry. And we're suggesting, we've got a bunch of these on the table where you signed in. When you leave today, please take a voter registration form and give it to a young person that you know that's not registered to vote yet. That's what we need to do. We need to get everybody voting, especially young people. And when you give this to them, tell them how to vote. Tell them how, not who to vote for. No, not who to vote for. The methodology. Let them know that they can go to votersedge.org/California to find their polling place and to find information that will help them decide how to vote. So talk about the process with them. Encourage them to go and vote with a friend and then celebrate afterwards. Hey, this is the first time I voted. So get the young people involved in this election. So please take one of these with you when you leave today and rack your brain and come up with a young person that you're going to encourage to vote. So with no further ado, because it looks like most people are seated now, I'm going to introduce Molly McGregor, who's the Executive Director of the National Women's History Alliance, who will be telling you a little bit more about our speaker.
Well, first I'd like to ask, who in this room has never heard of the Women's History Alliance before? Okay, good. So that gives me a chance to say a few things. The National Women's History Alliance started in Sonoma County, California. We were initially the National Women's History Project. We are the organization that spearheaded March to be National Women's History Week, and then March to be National Women's History Month. And in the process, we have changed the country and changed the world to recognize, honor, celebrate women's historic accomplishments. I'd like to just recognize 3 of my colleagues here who have also, this has always been a team effort. I've been at it for 40 years. People give me most of the credit. There's been hundreds of people I've never even known throughout the country that has made this possible. And I'm telling you, for the centennial, I am not exaggerating to tell you that there will be hundreds of thousands of parades, events throughout the country that finally recognize the courage, the determination, and the tenacity of what it took for women to win the vote. But I stopped for a moment, so don't worry, Paula, Maria, and Suzanne, would you please stand and take the credit that you deserve for all the work you've done. One of the things the National Women's History Alliance does is it determines the theme every year for Women's History Month. And this year's theme is Valiant Women of the Vote. We have a special gazette that talks about the 13 particular women that we recognize for their work on the vote, not just suffragists who work so hard for it, but the women who continue to try and break down some of the barriers that keep being put up to exclude the vote. So there's one of these for everybody on the back. Now we did another wonderful gazette, actually Bob did it, called Women Win the Vote. I thought I had it with me, but instead I just had the insert. So I would like to, here it is, Women Win the Vote. So I'd like to invite all of you, I'm gonna put a sign-in sheet back there. If you'd like to sign your name, I need your address too, because we're gonna mail it to you. And your email is really helpful. Or you can just call the National Women's History Alliance's office, toll free, because you live in Sonoma County, and say, hey, I really want one of those gazettes. It was a labor of love, to say the least. Okay, now with that said, I want to tell you about Bob Cooney. The National Women's History Project, we grew up completely as a grassroots movement. We were just young women who wanted to change the world. We wanted the schools to recognize that women were important, and it wasn't happening. And that's why we started with Women's History Week, because we started in the schools. We wanted teachers to have someplace where they could focus on women, because when we did surveys, we realized that in the school libraries, out of 500 books, there might have been 4 on women, and they were not very well written. But that's a whole other story. So we went to the county and we asked them if they would put Women's History Week on the school calendar, and they did. And 2 years later, President Carter issued a presidential proclamation, and the year after that, Congress issued their proclamation, and in 1987, they made it National Women's History Month. It really gave, people didn't know, we used to answer the phone, National Women's History Project, and they'd say, women's what? In the word women's history was foreign to them. I swear, I know now that we live in such a progressive era, we can hardly remember the misogyny and sexism of the past, but trust me, it existed. So as we're doing everything we can to promote Women's History Month and developing curriculum materials, there were no materials, there were no books. I mean, we were the source. At one time, we did $1 million in sales, and that's because Amazon hadn't butted in yet and given all their discounts. I mean, we were the only source for real women's history materials. And since that time, it has just exploded. The numbers of books, wonderful books, not quite as wonderful as this book, but wonderful books that you can read on the suffrage movement, on any of these individual women. My God, if you learn about their lives, you think, what am I complaining about? I better get my sorry out of bed and do something. So it was 1995. It was the 75th anniversary. It was going to be the 75th anniversary of women in the United States winning the right to vote. It was probably about 1993 or 94. We received this call from this man named Bob Cooney at the National History Project, and he called us and he said, so we'd like to know what you're going to do to celebrate the 75th anniversary of women winning the vote. And we paused and tried to seem really like we were with it and said, why don't you come up and we can talk about that? So when Bob came up, he had already designed this wonderful timeline that featured the women as well as the action of what it took from 1848 up until 1995 at that time. It was magnificent, it was incredible, and he launched it. He launched the real push for celebrating women in the United States winning the right to vote. He spent 17 years researching this book, and he did it at a time when there wasn't Google and Wikipedia and all that. Instead, he traveled throughout the entire country to these little archives, little people that, oh, did you think she was important? Oh, and assembled what is, I have read this book 7 times, and I've read a lot of books, and it's still the best because it's so thorough. It's about their guts. I tease him every once in a while because I say to him, hey, Bob, which one of those girlfriends of yours are you going to talk about today? Because he knows so much about what they did, but mostly what they went through. And the reason his motivation for this, one of the motivations, was that Bob was brave enough to be a draft resistor during the Vietnam War. And when he went to trial, at the very last minute, they always convicted draft resistors and put them in jail for, I don't know, 6 months, 6 years, whatever the judge decided at the time. Anyway, so he sat there willing to go to jail for a principle of nonviolence. And at the very last minute, the jury, one of the jurors was excused, and they put on this young woman who looked very prim, very proper, and she became the alternate juror. Well, they waited and waited, and the assumption was always that he would be convicted. No one hadn't been convicted. And lo and behold, they came back with what is that when no decision? Hung jury. I was a hung jury. They couldn't believe it, and of course it was a hung jury. They're not going to turn around and try him again. As it turns out, that young woman, that one woman, was really probably a certified hippie if we knew it. And from Sonoma. And she dressed up to the nines that day so that she'd be respectable. And she would not vote to put him in jail for standing up for the principles of nonviolence. That one woman made that kind of difference in Bob's life. And Bob, paying her back and paying us all back, has spent the last 17, 18, now it's 20 some years, isn't it? Oh, where did it go? Anyway, researching, promoting, recognizing, celebrating, but telling the stories of these extraordinary women and men's lives. I cannot tell you the pride I feel with this man being my friend and colleague, Robert Cooney.
Thank you, Molly, and the library and the league. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Molly says that about everybody. So. I'm delighted to be here. This is a very, very special day. I'm a graphic designer, so you'll see that reflected in my presentation. My concern was to show what happened, not just to write a book that's full of words, but to have images that help people really understand what people went through. And you know how you remember images, so that's sort of what the idea was, to plant these seeds in people's minds. So that's why I did all that research, to try to find the photographs especially. I didn't go into letters or manuscripts as much, but trying to find visual material. And what does the suffragists put out? Were there leaflets? What are their posters? What was the suffragists' voice? Every time I could, I wanted to use their words, and to point out this is what they did at the time. So as you all know, this is the centennial. Here we are. It's a centennial of the League of Women Voters and of women winning the right to vote, an event which is a critical turning point in American history. The year opened, there we are, with the Women's Suffrage Centennial float in the Pasadena Rose Parade on New Year's Day, which I hope some of you saw. It was a magnificent spectacle. It was 55 feet long. The flower-covered float had the descendants of suffragists on the deck, waving behind it, and behind them came 10 rows of 10 women each, all dressed in white, waving and being cheered as they passed down through the crowd. And the float won the theme award for capturing the parade's theme of hope this year. It was very, very dynamic and a wonderful experience for all the people who were in it as well. So there are exciting plans underway for the rest of the year too, including a team of women skydivers who are going to try to set a world record over Chicago in July. They're going to try and get 100 women linking arms to set a record as they're falling to the earth at 180 miles an hour. Now that's symbolic of what the suffragists took on. So there are many other things happening. There's going to be official buildings illuminated in suffrage colors on August 26th, and anybody can do anything like that, either official or unofficial buildings, it doesn't matter, but there's a government effort to put the governor's houses and the state houses and so forth throughout the country in suffrage colors for August 26th. There's going to be many, many art projects and exhibits. As Molly already mentioned, her flag is one that's happening throughout the country right now. And there's a new statue for New York's Central Park. It's Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Sojourner Truth. And it's the first statue of real women to be in Central Park. The others are fantasy people, or they're all men, including men from many other places besides the United States. But in addition to these, there's now centennial organizations in virtually every state. And here are the logos from Maine and California groups. Many of these groups have wonderful websites full of resources, history, biographies, and calendars of upcoming events. So even if you're not interested in Texas, you can go to the Texas site and learn about Black suffragists in Texas, for instance. Or go to Massachusetts, and there are downloadable panels that they're doing exhibits on. So they're wonderful resources. So if people are interested in finding out more about the centennial, the web has a wonderful, wonderful array of resources from all the different states. And I'll mention one of the national ones is here. The Women's Vote Centennial is the federally funded group that's calling for the colored flag, colored buildings and all. So throughout 2020, we'll celebrate passage of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, that enfranchised half the population, will also celebrate the rise and the empowerment of women throughout the country and the successful nonviolent civil rights movement that women waged and won despite overwhelming obstacles. The drive for votes for women, or women's suffrage, lasted over 72 years, from before the first Women's Rights Convention in 1848 to after 1920, really, to the present, really, in terms of the ongoing struggle for voting rights. Native American women, Asian Americans, and Black Americans, particularly in the South, did not immediately benefit from the 19th Amendment, whose implementation was blocked by other discriminatory laws and practices. But valiant women like these kept struggling to win their basic civil rights and eventually to triumph. The suffrage movement is literally a central part of American history. It reflects both the limits and the hopes of our democracy and the fervent, undying drive for self-government. One thing I've learned is that describing suffragists' goal as simply equality with men is a bit misleading. Professor Ellen Du Bois wrote that freedom might be a better slogan to emblazon on the women's rights banner than equality. What women were seeking was emancipation from the subordination to men. It was always about autonomy, independence, and liberation, and not just about the vote or women's legal position. That sense of freedom, I think, here we are. The sense of freedom is almost tangible, I think, in this image of excited and determined suffragists joining hands while marching in the 1915 suffrage parade in New York. Women winning their basic civil rights is a story of working together and claiming power. Many of the tactics suffragists chose are still quite relevant to the efforts for social change today. As suffragists showed, taking action is the most direct answer to injustice and social ills. They chose to speak out, to organize, and to willingly sacrifice for their cause. Year after year, women throughout the country took on leadership roles, risked their reputations, gave their time and savings, and dared controversial actions to move their cause ahead. So how did they do it? How did women win their own civil rights, and how did they manage to actually change the United States Constitution? Those are the questions that were sort of driving me. How did it work? Not just that it happened. So to briefly summarize today, I divided the movement into three parts that reflect their priorities, although they often overlap to some degree. The first is waging state campaigns, the second is going national, and the third is pressuring the federal government, all for the 19th Amendment. The first phase is waging state campaigns. The suffrage movement grew from women's efforts in the states in the mid-19th century and gained momentum for 70 years. Residents of every state were involved, and the movement's history lies mainly in the states. Concerned women met together in the 1840s and 1850s and held women's rights conventions for more than a decade before they were interrupted by the Civil War. Early suffrage leaders spoke out, organized, wrote, and published. Here are a few who became prominent from the earliest years. Lucy Stone started the American Women's Suffrage Association in 1870 and published the Women's Journal for decades. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton began the National Women's Suffrage Association, and for several years published the influential women's rights newspaper, The Revolution. In 1890, the two groups merged to become the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which I'm going to call the National Association to be briefer. After the Civil War, women's rights activists saw how easily former male slaves were enfranchised through a constitutional amendment. So that became their lasting goal. Here, Elizabeth Cady Stanton testified for the amendment before the Congressional Committee in 1878, with Susan B. Anthony on her left. Stanton later says that she was so angered by the disrespect and inattention of the men she was talking to that she wanted to throw her manuscript into their heads. But she refrained. When the government and courts showed no willingness to recognize women's rights, suffragists turned to the individual states. They believed that enough states would lead to a constitutional amendment. Susan B. Anthony, who turned 200 today, led these difficult state campaigns with local and visiting women throughout the late 19th century into her 70s. Traveling extensively, she impressed audiences nationwide and became the public face for the suffrage movement. She also became a familiar figure in the Capitol, lobbying Congress every year for women's rights. Yet she was widely and viciously ridiculed, criticized, misrepresented, as these illustrations show. Here she is as a goose on the bottom left, or knocking on the door where she's kept out, or the one up in the top right is my favorite, where she's chasing after President Grover Cleveland after he made some awful remark about women. But over time, reporters and the general public came to respect Susan B. Anthony for her indomitable will, her determination, her good humor, and common sense. She became a beloved figure. The drive for women's suffrage was really a homegrown, grassroots movement with no public sanction, political support, or wealthy backing. The movement was made up of family and friends, women in particular, of all ages and backgrounds, who devoted themselves to improving women's lives. Suffragists lobbied the legislatures in each state to have their measure placed on the ballot. When they succeeded, which was rare, they ran ambitious campaigns to convince male voters. Suffragists tried this 18 times with virtually no funds before 1910. Men approved women's suffrage at only 2 elections, in Colorado and Idaho. Wyoming and Utah were territories that became equal suffrage states in the 1890s. These 4 states, symbolized by 4 stars, were the only places women could vote equally with men when Susan B. Anthony died in 1906. She was nationally mourned, finally recognized as an exceptional individual and leader of American women. So these state electoral campaigns were not for the faint-hearted. They were arduous and all-consuming adventures that demanded months of travel, a wide range of skills, and an unusual degree of self-sufficiency. Suffrage organizers, like Boston's Margaret Foley here, were exceptional women who were able to meet these many challenges. These women created a number of leagues, clubs, and organizations to advance their cause. They took a nonpartisan stance, and they regularly cooperated with men. Some of these women later became leaders of the League of Women Voters. The foremost example is Carrie Chapman Catt. Carrie Lane, as she was born, was a teacher and school superintendent in Iowa. She joined her state suffrage association around 1887 when she was 28, and later wrote, "I have given my life to the suffrage work. I've opened the doors of churches and halls and lighted the kerosene lamps, attended to the babies while the meeting was in progress, made the speech, taken the collection, pronounced the benediction, organized the club or committee, and have held all the offices imaginable, from club president up, down, and sidewise." Catt campaigned in the western states during the 1890s, often in the company of Susan B. Anthony, and had her first taste of success as an organizer in Colorado in 1893. There, male voters approved equal suffrage at the polls for the very first time. This image from the 1896 contest in California shows Susan B. Anthony in the middle, with Anna Howard Shaw on the left and Carrie Chapman Catt on the right. In 1900, Catt was elected to succeed Susan B. Anthony as the head of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Catt led the struggling group for 4 years, putting it on a firmer foundation with more state participation. She was succeeded for 11 years by Anna Howard Shaw, who had also traveled with and learned from Susan B. Anthony. In the following years, Carrie Catt traveled the world, meeting with women on their 3 continents. In 1912, she was a guest at the Chinese Women's Rights Convention. She later noted, "You cannot imagine how hard is the struggle for liberty which they have to make." International travel seasoned the Midwesterner and added a larger context to her work. When she returned home to lead the effort in New York, she continued to be active as president of the International Women's Suffrage Association, which she founded. At about the same time Carrie Catt was coming to national prominence, Maud Wood Park was organizing college women. Park went to a women's suffrage meeting in 1900 and realized that she was the youngest person there. So she and another Radcliffe senior organized the first college equal suffrage league in Boston. Over the following decade, she traveled widely to organize branches of the new league. This is a rare handmade poster for a meeting of the College League at Stanford around 1910. Park told students and recent graduates that they were indebted to women's rights advocates because their work enabled women to go to college. Like these marching there in their caps and gowns to show they were educated enough to vote. Maud Park also traveled, as Catt did, to study women's conditions in other countries before returning to help the drive for suffrage in Massachusetts. A new generation of suffragists rose up throughout the country during these years. These women were all active in their own states and beyond. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns later formed the National Woman's Party. The bottom picture suggests the founding of the Women's Suffrage Party in New York in 1909, with state leader Carrie Catt on the right. Suffrage speakers and field workers from the National Association crisscrossed the country for decades, despite the difficulties and the personal dangers of women traveling on their own, to put their case directly to state voters. And that unwavering faith in democracy is part of what we remember and celebrate today. Looking closely at California, yes, offers a good example of what these state campaigns were like. Here's an open-air Votes for Women rally in 1911 outside UC Berkeley. Margaret Haley, the suffrage speaker and school teacher from Chicago, stands ready to speak. As in most states, the 1911 California campaign was led by local women and men, including older, experienced suffragists, as well as new college graduates, working girls, professionals, business, and club women. It's good to remember that each state drive was run by real women and men who we can identify if we try. In this case, Elizabeth Watson led the California Equal Suffrage League, the statewide group. Charlotte Whitney led the College Equal Suffrage League. John Brawley founded the Political Equality League in Southern California. And Maud Younger was a talented labor organizer up here in Northern California. Ellen Sargent was a widely respected pioneer. Lillian Coffin founded the Club Women's Franchise League. Mary Keith was a generous supporter from Berkeley, and Clara Foltz led the Votes for Women Club in Los Angeles, where one of the federal buildings is now named after her. After dividing it in two, suffragists from all these many groups canvassed the great state, creating a highly visible campaign that attracted national attention. The contest featured innovations like giant posters, great electrical signs, lantern slideshows, the use of automobiles for street speaking, and rallies and meetings of every kind. This campaign poster clearly advised men to give your girl an equal chance with your boy. Local women organized clubs throughout the state and created floats like this one from San Diego with a very current theme, equal pay for equal work, regardless of sex. This was 1910. Suffragists campaigned heavily in the Bay Area, where saloon interests were strongest, as well as in the vast areas of Central and Southern California. Experienced organizers came from other states and went out to the far counties and small towns to speak with farmers, ranchers, miners, loggers, and voters, wherever they could find them. Women from all backgrounds participated in the campaign, and some, like Chinese women, knowing that even if the amendment won, they would still not be allowed to vote. As the October 10th election grew closer, opponents became more vocal. Suffragists knew the contest would be close. On Election Day, early Bay Area returns showed that the measure had been soundly defeated. However, over the following 3 days, the results came in from the distant counties and narrowly swung the election in women's favor. By a paper-thin average of only 1 vote per voting precinct, women in California won the right to vote. Good work and good California men. Here's a confident lady who shows she can easily balance both the family life and the ballot, which was one of the controversial points at the time. The election added a 6th star and electrified suffragists across the country. Over the next 3 years, in the same manner, they waged another 14 campaigns and won 5 more states. further solidifying women's political power. But even in states where suffragists never made the ballot, local and state associations still drew in and trained women who gained experience and rose to leadership locally and nationally. The National Association sent organizers, literature, and moral support to state contests, but the lack of strong national leadership with financial resources and clear direction resulted in more independent grassroots activity at the state level. One example was the first organization of women voters. The National Council of Women Voters was founded by Western suffrage leader Emma Smith DeVoe in 1911, after Washington became the 5th equal suffrage state. This nonpartisan council educated new voters and backed equal suffrage in other states and public interest legislation. The Council of Women Voters grew to include all the equal suffrage states until it was eventually merged into the new League of Women Voters. So the second phase after the state is going national. Gradually, suffragists won more states in the West, building up women's real political power nationally. But in addition to organizing in each state, suffragists went national by refining their strategies, picking up partial victories, and targeting suffrage opponents. In one critical breakthrough, suffragists in Illinois, shown here finally crossing the Mississippi, persuaded their state legislatures in 1913 to pass a presidential suffrage bill. That allowed women to vote for some local offices and presidential electors every 4 years, and that didn't scare the men in the legislature. That seemed like a minor point. Suffragists in other states soon took the same strategy and built it of accepting partial victories into a real political force. These are early hit pieces against anti-suffrage politicians. So even though women in the East couldn't vote, they still took on powerful opponents in the Massachusetts and New York legislatures and mounted effective campaigns against them. This bold new strategy also put other politicians on notice. Women didn't have to be voters to be politically active. Or to be funny, don't vote for a clown. It's a good piece of propaganda there. Another way suffragists became active nationally was putting pressure on the two major political parties, demanding their support for the suffrage amendment. In St. Louis for the 1916 Democratic Convention, suffragists staged a remarkable walkless parade to make clear their demand. Here, 8,000 suffragists dressed in white and yellow formed a silent golden lane for nearly a mile on both sides of the street that Democratic delegates had to take to get to their convention. That's Woodrow Wilson crouching in the center under a cloud of gloom as he passes down the golden lane. After ignoring women's demands for decades, both parties included suffrage in their 1916 platforms, but only on a state-by-state basis, not through a constitutional amendment. So it's familiar, these partial victories and a step ahead and a back, so suffragists went through that constantly. In reaction to the disinterest of the major parties, suffragists organized new political parties themselves. These included the Women's Suffrage Party in New York and the National Women's Party in Washington, D.C. At several national elections, starting in 1914, Alice Paul called on women in the Western states who could vote to boycott Democratic candidates to force the ruling party to support the 19th Amendment. And it's very clear, oppose the party which blocks the national suffrage amendment, defeat the Democratic candidates for Congress. It was a very bold and a controversial move. Another change with national impact came when male and female voters in Montana elected the very first woman to Congress, who was organizer and state suffrage leader Jeanette Rankin. Here she addressed supporters from Suffrage House in the Capitol with Carrie Catt in the background before taking her seat in 1917. Throughout this time, African American women organized in their own communities with little connection to white suffragists or state organizations. Despite discrimination, particularly in the South, and racism everywhere, Black women worked together through their own clubs, suffrage organizations, and church groups to educate others and advance the drive for women's rights. In 1896, the two largest African American club associations merged to form the National Association of Colored Women. Delegates elected Mary Church Terrell, a leading suffragist, as its first president and adopted the telling motto, "Lifting as we climb." W.B. Du Bois edited The Crisis, which was also pro-suffrage, and is now scanned and available online. Suffragists were indeed going national. In one decade, from 1910 to 1920, they waged 36 state campaigns for an overall total of 54. Eventually, men in 15 states approved equal suffrage. Women had won real political power in nearly all the states in the West, as this wonderful 1915 image, The Awakening, shows. Unenfranchised women elsewhere were reaching out for liberty. The next step was to make the federal government pass the 19th Amendment. The third phase is pressuring the federal government. In December 1915, Carrie Chapman Catt, who was 56, was again elected to lead the National Association, where her talent and experience were sorely needed. State campaigns had stalled, and the federal government still dodged any responsibility. The suffragists were divided, war was imminent, and the opposition seemed overwhelming. This is where her leadership made a critical difference. After meeting with suffrage leaders across the country, she formulated a plan to finally push the amendment through, and if her plan was rejected, she was prepared to resign. She called for harder work in each state for full or partial suffrage, and finally put the full weight of the National Association behind the drive for the federal amendment. Carrie Catt's proposal became known as the winning plan, and its genius was how it offered suffragists in each state a set of customized goals that coordinated with work throughout the country. She insisted on the agreement of 36 state suffrage leaders who pledged to keep the plan secret to catch opponents off guard. To lead the renewed lobbying effort in Washington, D.C., she turned to Maud Wood Park, who for the next 2 years led a quietly effective lobbying effort out of the drafty old Capitol mansion they called Suffrage House. Women came from around the country to lobby their state representatives under Maud Wood Park's watchful eye, while Jeanette Rankin championed the cause in Congress. This final version of suffragist congressional committee became known as the Front Door Lobby, named for its straightforward approach. These women worked diligently through freezing weather, wartime shortages, and the deadly flu epidemic to keep their bill moving through Congress despite the overwhelming physical and emotional demands of World War I. In 1917, suffragists increased pressure on the federal government, specifically the president and congressmen, to support the 19th Amendment. While mainstream suffragists with the National Association continued to lobby and court politicians, the more militant National Woman's Party took further steps to break the logjam. In early 1917, they began to silently picket the White House, demanding action. Banners asked, "Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage?" And "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" Which are great slogans because when people were passing by to watch these people demonstrating, they would read the banners and they'd say, "Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage?" It's a great way of communicating. Led by Alice Paul's Women's Party, suffragists kept up the picketing throughout the year, despite freezing temperatures and the declaration of war in April. When the Wilson administration ordered Capitol Police to begin arresting the picketing suffragists in the spring, more women arrived to take their place. Hundreds were arrested during 1917, and when they refused to pay their fines for obstructing traffic, they were sent to jail. The pickets outside the White House were often mobbed, jeered, and insulted by mobs of men before the police arrived and arrested the women. They were attacked repeatedly, but these silent sentinels stood firm against the abuse. As more women were sentenced to prison for blocking the sidewalk, they decided to claim status as political prisoners, jailed not for their crimes, but for their political beliefs. When the prison administrators ignored their demand, many of the women responded by going on a hunger strike. Prisoners, including Alice Paul, were brutally force-fed through tubes forced down their noses and throats. It was a form of torture that drew national outrage and put additional pressure on politicians to act. This image is from the British suffrage movement, where the same thing happened. Suffragists from across the country struggled desperately to keep their cause alive and keep pressure on Congress and the president during the war. Alice Paul, Carrie, Catt, and other leaders pointed out the bitter irony of a nation fighting a war to defend democracy abroad while denying women democracy at home. Here's suffragist Lucy Branham burn the words of President Wilson in Lafayette Park, just across from the White House, protesting his hypocrisy. Well, simultaneous with this year of picketing, arrests, and torture, New York was the scene of the last great state campaign in 1917, and it carried national importance. The drive involved women already consumed by wartime demands and appealed to men's patriotic fervor. We're ready to work beside you, fight beside you, and die beside you. Let us vote beside you. Over the previous year, suffragists had gathered the signatures of over 1 million New York women who said they wanted to vote, and mounted these signatures on great boards that they carried in the climactic 1917 parade. This strategy disproved the anti-suffragist central claim that most women didn't want to vote. The hard-won victory in New York on November 6, 1917, was seen as the writing on the wall by the politically observant. With the richest and most influential state on board, politicians and party leaders came to grudgingly accept the inevitability of women voting. Politicians understood that even without the 19th Amendment, women would be able to vote for president in 30 states in 1920. Women had won equal suffrage in 15 states and partial suffrage in another 15, where women could vote for presidential electors. Suffragist strategies had already positioned many women as powerful voting citizens. And of course, when you could vote for president, the president has to pay attention to you. So 30 states he had to watch for at that point. The final battle in Washington, D.C., including an intense lobbying drive by both the National Association and the Women's Party that grew to involve thousands of women from throughout the nation. Suffragists testified before congressional committees, kept card files on congressmen, organized local pressure, and overcame every obstacle to steer their controversial bill through Congress. And opponents delayed action for as long as possible. Finally, the strength of suffragist demand and the force of their pressure won Congress over in response to the intense lobbying, the picketing, and especially the real political gains in all the states. Both houses of Congress narrowly approved the 19th Amendment in 1919. In June, it was sent to the states to ratify. Suffragists needed to win 36 out of 48 states, while opponents only needed 13 states to defeat the amendment. Here's where suffragist strength in the many states really paid off in getting governors like Kentucky's Edwin Morrow here to back immediate ratification. In many states, special sessions needed to be called, and many governors were resistant. But by July 1920, the suffrage amendment had won approval by 35 state legislatures, most at special sessions. Carrie Catt led the difficult drive to win the final state, Tennessee, going there for a week and staying for over 2 tension-filled months. But with that last narrow victory on August 18th, the 19th Amendment was ratified and became part of the Constitution on August 26, 1920. Hooray! After 72 years of effort, over 20 million women were enfranchised. This was the largest single extension of suffrage without a revolution, and it was accomplished solely through disciplined, nonviolent action. As a final celebration after the last suffrage parade, Carrie Catt told her colleagues, "I have lived to realize the great dream of my life, the enfranchisement of women. We are no longer petitioners. We are not wards of the nation, but free and equal citizens. Let us practice the dignity of a sovereign people." Across the nation, celebrations marked the final victory. Women had won their long struggle and were finally included in the Constitution. The women's justice bell and church bells rang, and women nationally began a new chapter as full American citizens. Not all women could vote, however, and decades would go by before unjust laws were changed. Since new obstacles continue to appear, safeguarding our hard-won rights is still paramount. So the question then is, what happened after 1920? And that's one of the reasons we're here. After Congress passed the amendment, Carrie Catt proposed reconstituting the National Association into a new League of Women Voters, hoping to channel the energy of suffragists in the states after the final victory. Longwood Park returned to the Capitol as the first head of this new organization and led the League for the first 4 years. With former suffragists filling its ranks, the League immediately began to educate millions of new women voters. In keeping with its heritage, the League was largely nonpartisan, welcomed civic-minded men, and actively represented the public interest. The activist nature of the suffrage movement continued to influence the League's work, encouraging public displays and popular presentations, as well as careful research and analytical work. Belle Sherwin, a former suffrage leader from Ohio, was the League's second president. She served for 10 years and helped establish the League's reputation as a serious, accountable, and objective organization. Sherwin described the early League as a, quote, university without walls, whose members enter to learn and remain to shape the curriculum. Former Minnesota suffrage leader Marguerite Wells was the League's third president, serving the next 10 years until 1944. As president, she donated a portrait of Carrie Chapman Catt to the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery, where it hangs today. Wells' vision of the League called for a nucleus of people in each community who would carry a continuing responsibility for government. She envisioned that these individuals, today's League's members actually, would offer informed leadership on issues as they arose. There's a great story before I finish of Marguerite Wells that speaks to the personal passion behind all this. Like all these other notable women, she wasn't always a little old lady. Where is she here? Here I go. As a young girl on the unsettled prairie, she took a precocious interest in government. She once persuaded her father, who was a member of the territorial legislature, to let her accompany him to the all-male party caucus. Marguerite dressed as a boy and went disguised in a slicker with a cap pulled down over her short bobbed hair. And she was exhilarated by the talk she heard. These were men planning their common future and building their own government. You can imagine her genuine, youthful excitement at being where she felt she belonged. She returned home and wrote an account of it in rhyme. She later became a leader of women in Minnesota and then the nation. Marguerite Wells' vision of people taking a continuing responsibility for government is exactly what our suffrage foremothers did and encouraged others to do. In fact, for many years, the League was the main way women could become aware and active politically beyond voting. It took decades before the major political parties opened up to women and seriously supported women candidates. And when they did, many of those women had come up through the League. 100 years ago, suffragists passed the torch to new generations of women who have become a vital force in American politics. 100 years later, their dream is still alive and continues to inform and inspire us. In fact, it's a precious source of strength and hope. From its beginning, the League of Women Voters not only channeled the heritage of the suffrage movement, it also trained women to become informed civic leaders at the local, state, and national levels. Following in the footsteps of suffragists, League members held elected representatives accountable for true democracy and laid the foundation for equal political participation. Because the League successfully encouraged people to take responsibility for self-government, it has literally been making democracy work. Suffragists left us with a noble inheritance. It's one that embodies courage, commitment, and sacrifice, and also women's vision for our nation. We owe suffragists a great debt for their love and perseverance in moving the United States into becoming a more complete democracy. Harriet Stanton Blatch, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter, was justifiably proud when she wrote that American women were the first disfranchised class in history who, unaided by any political party, won enfranchisement by its own effort alone and achieved the victory without the shedding of a drop of human blood. On this historic centennial, we celebrate the 19th Amendment, the empowerment of women, and the inspiring nonviolent victory. Ratification of women's rights and women's dreams was finally realized by the efforts of women and the votes of men 100 years ago. It's a lasting heritage we share and we can all be proud of. It's an honor to pay tribute to American suffragists today and to the League of Women Voters on their 100th anniversary. Here's to the continued success of our League and to the further flowering of our precious democracy. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you, to honor these women today and what they accomplished. This is my book from which most of these images were taken. So thank you very much. These women. This is why I stayed at it. It's an exciting, amazing story, and it's much, much broader than what I was able to do here.
I can't hear you.
I'm sorry, I've gone in and out of the microphone, I think. I was just going to mention before, we can take some questions or comments or feedback if you want, but the Gazette, I would really point out to you that Molly mentioned was going to bring some, but there are a lot of Gazettes going around now. We highlight African-American suffragists. We highlight every state and what's happening in the states and what the plans are for the centennial ahead. So this is a very useful piece. It's also downloadable online. If you go to the National Women's History Alliance website, you can download this and several other earlier gazettes. The Alliance has been one of the main forces to make people aware of the suffrage centennial. We started about 3 years ago and put out a series of publications to try to encourage people to do things in the states where they are and to realize that the suffrage movement is a national movement and every state has suffragists. All you have to do is look. It's worthwhile. But if there is some response or some comments or...
Bob, could you tell the story about in 1920 in Tennessee, the mother writing the letter to the
That's going to become an American story. That's going to be the subject of the women's hour. Yeah. Hillary Clinton and Steven Spielberg are doing a TV show series about the final state that ratified. And, it's a southern state, and it was very, very close. And you had the situation where the head of the House would say, I'll take charge of your suffrage legislation, and I'll make sure it goes through. And they'd come back to the meeting the next day, and the guy had changed to the opposite side. So you had that kind of political deviance throughout their events. But when they took the vote, finally, it was very, very close. And it came out to a tie. And Harry Burns stood up and he took off his red rose, which symbolized he was going to vote against suffrage, and he threw it to the floor to the horror of all his cohorts who were also anti-suffragists. But he said, I think a boy should do what he should do, and he patted his pocket and said, I got a letter from my mom who said to make sure I do the right thing and to put the rat in ratification to support Mrs. Catt. And he did. So there's a lot about, that whole story. He was 24. He took a big risk, and it hurt his political future, but he became widely respected for that act of conscience. He said, when do you get a chance to enfranchise 20 million people? So he took it, thank God.
That wonderful story is told in a really fun way in Lady Gaga's video, and I shared that with a lot of the younger women that I know, and that's really sung to them.
It's a great music video that to a Lady Gaga tune with rewritten words, and Alice Paul and suffragists are in there. Yes?
Can you speak, you said not all women got the vote, the right to vote, and that passed, and I understand the black women didn't get the right until 1965.
There was Chinese Exclusion Acts. Native Americans weren't seen as citizens. So there were several groups that were immediately ostracized. So then they had to work specifically to get Native American rights, and we try to get that nationally, but then it turns out each state has the right to do it. So there was a lot of difficulties in trying to get that.
Is that in your book?
I didn't go into the Native Americans or the Asian Americans. I didn't know as much about it, and they couldn't vote. So it's in our, it's mentioned in here with the dates and the other post-1920 activity.
I think what she's referring to is the 1965 The Voting
The
Rights
65
Act.
Voting Rights Act, yeah, for civil rights for black women.
That all women were granted the right to vote in 1920 unless they were discriminated against because of what Bob just said. But in 1965, in 1965, with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, that's when the whole voting registration thing happened in the South, because it wasn't that black women couldn't vote because of the amendment. The reason they couldn't vote is because of the racism and the restrictions within their communities. So that's why sometimes people say, oh, well, black women didn't gain the right to vote in 1920. Yeah, they did. It's just that one more time, racism and discrimination, held them back. But then we had the Fannie Hamers of the world, and the story goes on. But as I'm saying this, remember that voting suppression is happening all around this country right now. We know the league is going to go get them, but let's remember that that there are some people. I know this is going to surprise everyone, but there are some people who would rather us not vote, and I won't name names.
Thank you.
Somewhat related to that, that same person remains nameless. He has chosen California to be his least popular place. He's put us very behind in the census, both by withholding the money that we were supposed to get for the census and by making everything so incredibly complicated. I would like to ask everyone to be sure and put the word out to have everyone fill out their census forms. The very people who can most benefit from the $80 billion waiting to be assigned through the Treasury Department for the census are the people who are most terrified of our government and the least likely to be counted. So it's a really important year for the census.
Thank you. I'll mention what's up here are the main centennial sites. So if you're interested in more on the centennials, 2020 Centennial is a group that I work with, the Women's Votes Centennial Initiative, and Molly's on the board too. And the Women's Votes 100 is a federally funded one. Both of them have very good websites that put you in touch with resources and states and so forth. And the bottom one is the National Women's History Alliance, where the gazettes are and so forth. I would pick up on what the lady in the back said, that this is all very relevant. And I think we all realize that, voting is really a key part of our society. And what it took to get here shows how important it is, I think. It wouldn't have been so hard fought if it wasn't so important. And it was hard fought up until the very end, and almost, I won't say all the victories were very, very narrow. Harry Byrne at the very end, we won by one vote, In Congress, it was 2 votes to get the House to approve the amendment at the end. But it was always that kind of just hair-splitting work that the suffragists had to do just to push it just enough over the line. And thank God they were able to do it.
Like just in opposing, there was a national organization of women who were opposed to the 19th Amendment and to women's.
That's right. There were women who were against women voting, sad to say. And some very talented women too, with their own reasons. Yeah.
The logo, the poster on the left, is that the logo for the graphic for the 2020 Centennial? And if so, what does that represent?
Well, it was the Torch of Freedom, and it is the symbol for the Women's Vote Centennial Initiative. And this was the League of Women Voters and the National Women's Party and suffrage-related organizations several years ago got together to say we should take, the leadership in this position to make this happen. So they were the suffragists, the current day suffragists, you could say. And so we went to one of our members went to a design firm in Minneapolis and asked them to help us do some kind of logo that we could use throughout the country. And this is what they came up with. A young woman there came up with this idea of a torch that had many interchangeable parts, and the idea was to highlight either states or issues, or a lot could be done with that graphically, which we haven't done. But it is the poster for the whole year centennial celebration.
Alice Paul's organization is not mentioned very often when people learn about women's history, it seems to me. It's always Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Carrie Chapman, Catt Chapman, in fact, or Chapman Catt, I always mix it up. But Alice Paul and Sojourner Truth, who's now in the statue in Washington, D.C. Can you talk a little bit about how the importance of Alice Paul's organization?
About, what about?
About the importance
Oh,
of
importance,
Alice Paul's organization.
The way I see it, you had Carrie Chapman Catt in charge of a big national organization, and she's 58. And then you got this young lady coming up who's in her late 20s, and a whole younger, spontaneous, smaller, risk-taking organization. And that's what the Women's Party really was, and it was a congressional committee before that. It had different names. But it was trying to organize a younger, more militant energy, especially inspired by Great Britain, where the suffragists were much more outrageous and doing controversial things. So it was saying that the Carrie Catt's organization was a little too stable, a little too old-fashioned, and not getting results. So that's why Alice Paul came along, and Lucy Burns with her, and a whole nother generation, basically, of women. And some of the Catt's group went over to the Women's Party. And many people I read, especially throughout the country, that joined both. You know, it was like we're for suffrage, so there those kind of differences that were strong in Washington, D.C. weren't so important in Kentucky or some other state. But it was Alice Paul's leadership that gave a strategic sense of what are we going to do and how are we going to do it, and to lead the boycott of the Democratic candidates. That scared the Democrats. They realized that women could go against them. And here we have all these states in the West where women are voting. So it was really a clear political power move, but it was seen as too controversial and negative by Carrie Catt and the more established suffragists. And same with the picketing. When the picketing happened, Catt and the mainstream said, we don't support this. It wasn't a unified structure at all. And when the women were being tortured in prison, Carrie Catt's group didn't say anything. You know, there was very few people. Jeanette Rankin was one who spoke up and said, women shouldn't be treated this way. This is just not right. So you had these kind of differences, and you could see the groundbreaking work that Alice Paul's group was doing. And after 1920, she wrote the Equal Rights Amendment. And she knew it wasn't over, you know, and she knew the next step was to push for more equal rights and overturning all the laws that were discriminating against women throughout the country, which is a huge operation and I think still goes on today.
It sounds like Alice Paul Corner. Here, but I was reading about her just this year, and I was struck. She learned her tactics over in England with the Pankhurst family, and how they were force-fed women, not the men.
One man.
One man?
One man was.
Okay, know that. Thank you. And she was the one who developed the idea. They bought a house across the street from the entry to the White House,
Right.
which I thought was remarkable, sense of geography. And she's the one who came up with the idea of sending women out in silent protest, to simply stand there as a measure of dignity and respect for the institution. Gee, doesn't that sound familiar? As represented by the White House, but to protest the way Wilson was treating them, as badly as Wilson was treating them. He ignored them repeatedly as he drove in and out of the White House. And so Alice Paul, I agree somewhat, doesn't seem to get the same recognition for the revolutionary steps that she took and drove people enough to those extra steps. Not to undermine the organizations of the others, but, and then finally, when Alice Paul and so many of the women in her organization were thrown into prison repeatedly, into jail, and they weren't allowed to be called political prisoners. They were fed dreck. They were given very difficult work routines, and they were thrown into, and you know, there was no social security. You know, there was probably not too many loving husbands waiting at home for them to get out, and they were thrown into jail in Washington repeatedly. These are just heroic revolutionary. You said something about without a revolution, and I just disagree. I think there was a revolution. It wasn't as violent.
You're right.
I'm going to ask you to
I'm
stop your
sorry.
comments because we do need to move on to the next part of our program. And Robert is going to be available here. He has some of his books here. You can ask him individual questions as he's signing your book. So let's give him one more round of applause.
Now birthday cake.
Yes, and now birthday cake. So really quickly before we do that, I would like each league member who helped with today, either on the Centennial Committee or as a volunteer, to please stand up. And I want you all to be acknowledged, so please stand up. Because I want to point out, we are a 100% volunteer organization locally in Sonoma County. We depend on volunteers and our members for everything we do. So they have put a lot of work into putting this birthday party together. They have a refreshing beverage that you can pick up and for our toast. And they have cupcakes that you can eat to enjoy and celebrate our birthday. And I'm going to lead off the toast. I toast all the women of the past who worked so hard and dedicated their lives to giving us all the vote. And I also toast to all of you who are here in this room and all the women in Sonoma County who are working so hard still on women's rights. And I toast all the men who are in this room and in this county who support the women's movement and who support all of us have equal rights. And the work is not done. So I also toast to the Equal Rights Amendment, which we are still trying to pass.
It's always a struggle.
How do you synthesize it down
Sophie.